So the last talk was very much about the data. This talk is much more conceptual. Measuring progress, trying to understand whether life is getting better for a society or a country is one of the most important questions any government can ask, and it's exercised philosophers since the ancient Greeks. And yet it's something we typically do very badly around the world. Typically still it's measures like gross domestic product, measures of dollars, cents or francs that determine whether people think life is getting better, and yet they're very, very poor measures of well-being. So I want to talk about the work the United Nations has been doing now for 30 years on measuring human development. I'll talk about where that work came from, how we actually do it, and then look at the links between that and happiness, human happiness, which is one of my own research interests, but also what that might mean for measuring something like Baukultur, because for me there are many parallels between that and human development. The people who invented gross domestic product, the system of national accounts, it was born in the 1930s. It was really to help America navigate the Great Depression and was then very useful in World War II. Really is trying to understand how much money they had to drop bombs on enemies, essentially. The economist who invented it went to Congress in the US and warned at the time, please don't start using this as a measure of welfare or well-being. It isn't that at all. It's simply how much money is changing hands. And yet, within 20 years, because of the Cold War and many other reasons, around the world, the measure of national income, how much money, how busy we are in an economy, became synonymous with progress. And that was a problem, because it was really leading governments and societies to value the wrong things and take the wrong decisions. So much so that Bobby Kennedy, in 1968, he may well have gone on to become a president of the US. He made this wonderful speech where he talked about the problems that this focus on money and income and national accounts was having in the US. Ended up by saying, you know, GDP, it measures everything except that which makes life worthwhile. And that's very much the background of where the work on human development came from in the UN. In the second half of the 20th century, there were debates going on around development economists especially, about how do we understand development? How do we know if it's working? How do we know if countries are actually developing? We need benchmarks. We're spending all this money, investing all this money, doing all this work, and yet there's very little measures of whether countries are getting better other than things like GDP, which is, we believe, a very poor measure. So various ideas were trialed, and in the late 1980s, Amartya Sen, who was a Nobel Prize-winning economist and a philosopher, came up with this idea of human development, saying development for him was equivalent to freedom. It was about giving people capabilities, choices, freedoms to be and to do the things they found worthwhile. And for him, that was the way to think about development in ways other than GDP. And so the UN came along and said, we like the philosophy, but we need to measure this, because measurement is really important. So this is another Nobel Prize winner, Joe Stiglitz, prize-winning economist, who was part of a commission that President Sarkozy put together in France in 2008. It was a measurement of economic progress and economic performance and social progress. And President Sarkozy put this together because at the time he could see there was a disconnect between what the statistics in France were saying about the progress of the country and what the average French man and woman was saying on the street. The aggregate average figures for the nation were showing things were going well, the economy was quite strong. Yet talk to the average Parisian and they were complaining about the price of a baguette or the fact that things were going up in price. So for him as a politician, this was a risk. He said, if people don't trust the statistics coming out of my government, they won't trust the politicians. So we need to look into this. So he put together this extraordinary commission with 5 Nobel Prize winners and all the greatest economists in the world on it to think about this. And they came up with a set of recommendations. But I think the most important, I think from the point of view of anyone seeking to measure something like Baukultur, is this quote here from Joe Stiglitz. We know, I think, many of us would know the phrase, we measure what matters. If you want to manage something, you need to measure it. So the idea that when something's important, we need to measure it, that I think is accepted. What they did what Joe Stiglitz is saying here is twisting that on his head in reverse and saying, as soon as we start measuring something, it becomes more important. As a society, we pay more attention to the things we measure. So if we just start measuring something like Baukultur and actually putting numbers around it, automatically almost, governments, citizens, voters, the media, they start paying more attention to it. They think it's more important than before. So it's extraordinarily important to get those measures right. Because if you've got the wrong measures, and people say, well, these must be important because we're measuring this, if we've got the wrong measures, then we'll take the wrong decisions, we'll be looking at the wrong things. Our decisions will be distorted. So measurement is hugely important in any endeavor which is looking at progress or well-being or action. And that's, I know, has been a discussion here. So human development came out of this. It was really based on this idea of giving people more freedoms, as I said, more capabilities to do things. Choice is a fundamental part of this. Amartya Sen sees development and freedom as being almost synonymous. But what he was saying, what I mean by choice is, it's one thing, if someone has an education, they don't need to use it, but if they've got the opportunity to work, that's what's more important than whether or not they're actually working, because all of us as individuals, we value choice. And the example he would give is, consider two people who don't have enough to eat this week. They're both malnourished. One of them isn't eating because they're starving, because they have no money, the crops have failed, there's nothing, they've got no choice. The other is fasting for religious reasons. Now, both of those might be equally hungry, but from a development point of view, it's the first person that's more of a concern. So choice is embedded in this. We look at human development, there are certain things, these dimensions in yellow, that are things we would all agree, I think, directly enhance the quality of our lives. And there are things like health, education, having knowledge, and having income and decent standard of living. They're very important, direct measures. But then there's this whole ecosystem around that, which is extremely important to people's well-being, to development, to the way societies, economies work together. Having an environment that's sustainable, having human rights, having dignity, having political voice, and being able to participate. These are all important measures also of human development, but they're much more difficult to measure. But that doesn't mean they're not important. So in a sense, this is the sort of most current definition of this. It's this idea of living a long, healthy, and creative life, to having a chance to live a life you have reason to value, to pursue your goals, and to work together to engage and participate in decision-making that look at shaping development equitably and sustainably. But how do you measure that? That's the question. And that's, like Baukultur, that's an extraordinarily large and diverse set of things that it will be almost impossible to measure perfectly. So pragmatically, 30 years ago, two people at the UN who were working on this got together and said, we need a pragmatic measurement. It will be far from perfect, but it will take the debate beyond GDP. It will be a crude measure, but it's not as crude as GDP, so it's a step in the right direction. So all they did was said, let's take the simplest measure we can find data for. Let's look at health, education, income, take an average for each country, and then look at the rankings using that and see how it differs from GDP, and let's have a different debate about what development looks like. This is another way of characterizing it, just looking at the way those things fit together. The actual index itself it's now 4 numbers added together. 2 of them take an average for education. They're looking at both the averages of education in a country and how long a child starting school now can expect to stay there, which will change more quickly, which is more interesting to governments. Looking at standard of living, which is income per capita, and looking at life expectancy. So very far from perfect, far from everything that's human development, but it's a step in the right direction, we believe. And it really has had a profound effect on the development narrative, that measure. 20 years ago, you'd speak to economists, say, well, how would you measure development? And 9 times out of 10, 99 times out of 100, they'd say GDP. And then you might say to them, well, we all know the problems with GDP. It counts pollution, it counts crime, it doesn't account for unpaid work, and those other things that we know are important. They'd say, oh, well, maybe. And the more enlightened ones would say, well, okay, but it still correlates with all the things that matter. So we don't actually need to to think about anything else, because we all know that the way to develop is to grow GDP, and that's how people's health and education increases. And yet this graph here shows quite the opposite. This is from 2010, from our 20th anniversary report. There are two lines there, two correlations. The line in red is looking at the link between growth in human development and growth in income, or size in income and size of human development, and there's a strong correlation. So those economists that we talked to 20 years ago might say, told you, look at that perfect correlation there between income growth and development. And yet income is actually in the Human Development Index, so by pure mathematics there will be a correlation. Take that out and look at income growth, which is the second graph, the blue line, versus growth improvements in a country's health and education, and there is no statistical correlation there. There is no real effect. And that's immensely important if you're saying to countries the way to develop is to grow your income. This graph is saying, well, no, there's other ways to do that. Sure, that works sometimes, but you can also have a country where income growth is much more moderate, but you can see health and education improve, which actually translates into the things people often care more about. So that really has changed the development narrative, that graph. It's a global index, so we get to compare countries with each other. That has strengths and weaknesses. Some countries don't like it, especially if they're down or relative to their neighbors. So every year when this index comes out, there will be heads of state getting in touch with UN offices around the world, angrily demanding to see the UN ambassador, saying, what's going on, why has our country dropped, whereas next door have gone up, this is embarrassing. But that's a good thing, because it's a start of a debate about the things that matter. It's a start of a different conversation. However, there are problems with the data. Because we're trying to compare all the countries of the world, we can only use data which is available everywhere, which is a very small subset of the things we'd like to measure, so it's very crude. And of course, there are many things that are important about development that differ between countries that we're just not capturing at all. So it's far from perfect, but it's a way to start these conversations about the things that matter. Some of the conversations that come up are things like this example here. If you look at Qatar in the Middle East, it has twice the income of Switzerland per person. And yet people here live longer, they're more educated than people in Qatar. So that's a question. Why? What are you doing here differently that gives these much better outcomes to citizens or residents of the country? Of course, the Human Development Index, because of where it came from in 1990, partly because of data constraints, it tells us nothing about sustainability, and that's a very obvious weakness. It tells nothing about distributions and inequality. If all the income in a country is going to one person, it's the same GNI per capita as if it's shared equally. There's no penalty for that in this measure. Nothing on happiness, on social cohesion, other things we know are important to people's lives, and nothing about Baukultur. So what can we do about that? One of the things I think has been very interesting in the last 10 years or so in particular is the explosion of interest in human happiness and measuring that. It's another way to have these debates about the things important in life, the things that matter to people. It's a simple way to have the debate, because you might need to take 10 minutes describing Amartya Sen's work on capabilities to someone, but I think everyone gets happiness straight away, so the media like it. So it's something that's happening. It's happening more and more. There's massive growth in both the literature on this and also our understanding of how well we can do this and the limitations of the measures. And it's become big business in politics these days. So Nicolas Sarkozy was interested in this. David Cameron there in 2010 saying it's a central pillar of government, in his opinion, was whether people's happiness and well-being is improving. It's not just about gross national income, it's about gross national well-being, he said. Angela Merkel has been working on this. And around the world, many other politicians get this. And I think one of the reasons they get this is because they know this ultimately will depend on how people vote. And looking at happiness can show things in a very different light to looking at the more traditional measures. And here's an example. This is looking at data from the UK in the run-up to the Brexit referendum. The green line is the proportion, the dark green line, sorry, is the proportion of people who are saying they're very happy or happy in Britain. And the light green is income. So if you're a politician and you're wondering what was going on with your voters and you looked at the light green line, then everything seems to be tracking, that's fine. If you look at the dark green line, look at that massive drop in the run-up to the Brexit referendum. So that would ring alarm bells. And that's the biggest drop ever recorded by Gallup, and they do this poll in 100 countries. They've been doing it for 10 years. So there's something really extraordinary was happening there in the UK. I don't know what it was, but maybe it was about all the arguments and division that the whole Brexit discussion had, and it's continuing to have, but it did recover slightly, at least after the referendum. For the Arab Spring, there is data from countries like Egypt where a similar story happens, a huge drop in well-being just before the Arab Spring and that revolution. So something is going on here that's of interest to politicians and should be to everyone, and it's different to what you'd get from looking at income. So you do get a different view of the world. And this is where I think contrasting happiness with something like human development can be very important. And I think it can also be important to something like Baukultur, because human development and Baukultur are rather similar to me. They're both conceptually broad areas that are probably impossible to measure precisely because there's so much in them. Both of them are by definition, by the way you've defined them, are good things. Human development is defined to be things that people desire, that give them better lives. Just we can't measure that very well. Baukultur is an environment that, I won't use your better definitions than I do, but it's something similar, right? It's a broad idea of a better environment or better place for people to live that gives people more well-being. So we can agree that it's a good thing by definition, but how do we measure that? We can't, not perfectly, so we have to rely on partial measures. The Human Development Index is a very partial measure. If the Human Development Index goes up, we can't say for certain that human development has gone up because it's missing so many other things. Similarly, I think any measure you might have for Baukultur, if that improves, you can't say for sure that real Baukultur has gone up, just the measure has. You can contrast that with something like happiness or subjective well-being, as it's called, and that's the opposite. That we don't know whether, if happiness, we can measure it accurately. The measures are very good now. We can say for sure, yeah, happiness has gone up, but we can't say whether really a better life is improved for people. Just because people feel happier, it doesn't mean necessarily they should be, or there are other things going on that might not be that desirable. So you've got these conceptual, can't measure it properly, versus can measure it well, but conceptually we can't be sure it's necessarily a good thing. Look at the two of them together, and you could do this for happiness and Baukultur as well, and you have a different story. Hopefully they link quite closely, because if we're having human development without happiness, or we're having happiness and there's no development behind it, then something's not working, and it correlates very strongly there. That's looking at the average Human Development Index for every country in the report versus the average happiness. So the good news is it correlates well. The better news is it doesn't correlate perfectly. There are outliers there, those countries with the green arrows. Some of them are much happier than what you'd expect given their level of human development. Something else is going on to sort of raise their happiness. Something's working well. Some of them are less happy. They're below the line. So given their level of health, education, income, they ought to be a lot happier than they are. So something has gone wrong, if you like, in those societies in their happiness. And that then starts asking a lot of questions. Policymakers can say, well, what's going on? Why are these happier? Why are they unhappier? And I can imagine a similar conversation happening around Baukultur, where you've got objective measures of the quality of the environment saying one thing, but people's responses and the way they feel are saying something different. And then you zone in on those places. What's happening? Why isn't this working? So I think it's, there's an Indian proverb that says, it's better to be blind than to see the world with one eye. And I think this is essentially what we're talking about here. So thank you.